You log in after Prelates 11. Your favorite ability suddenly hits for 1. Your friend's build is fine and the game never tells you why. It's not a bug. It's not a stealth nerf. It's the armor system doing exactly what it was designed to do. And just to be clear, this is not a rant. By the end of this video, you will understand why the armor system sometimes feels off and how its underlying mechanics and design limits work. So you can give DE feedback that actually hits the core of the problem. Here is a plan. First, we will break down Soulframe's armor system in the simplest possible way. Then we will look at how this system behaves once numbers start changing, different value ranges, different hit frequencies and why that matters. And after that, we will take a look at how other games handle similar problems and what we can learn from them. And in the end, we will talk about what all of this means for Soulframe's balance going forward. Let's start with the fundamentals. Soulframe uses a flat armor absorption system. That sounds complicated, but the rule is incredibly simple. The armor of your opponent is directly subtracted from the damage you do. And if this results in 0 damage, Soulframe shows a minimum of 1 damage. If an enemy has 100 armor and you hit for 90, Soulframe shows 1 damage. And if you hit for 140, it shows 40. In the game, this is when you see a gray health bar over the enemy's head. That bar simply means your base attack is smaller than the enemy's absorption value. That's the entire system. No percentage, no hidden formulas, just subtraction. And on paper, that looks clean and easy to understand. And honestly, its short-term impact is just as simple. If your weapon or ability deals less damage per hit than the enemy's armor, it won't get through. Your flying dagger does nothing? Throw a spear. If that's all you needed to fix your build today, then great, you already have the practical takeaway. But if you want to understand the system on a deeper level, how it actually shapes the game and why it matters for Soulframe's future, and why so few RPGs use flat absorption, that's what the rest of this video is for. If you want to go further, well, consider this the part where I offer you the red or the blue pill. Let's begin. Most games use percentage-based mitigation instead. The take 30% less damage type of system we are all used to. Flat absorption, by contrast, shows up more often in tabletop games or tactical systems, where numbers stay small and progression stays tightly controlled. A few video RPGs have used it. Gothic 1 and 2's armor system is a classic example, and Champions Online once had a power armor set that worked this way. But as a main defensive system, it's unusual. And there's a very good reason for that. To understand why this simple mechanic becomes complicated in Soulframe, we need to look at how flat armor behaves once damage values start rising, and the total range of possible numbers in the game increases. When that spread reaches a critical mass, flat armor stops behaving like a mitigation system, and that's where the real problems begin. So let's break that part down next. Let's walk through a simple example. Imagine a line of damage values ranging from 1 all the way to 1000. Now drop a single armor value into that line. Let's say 100. Everything from here on is defined by how that armor value interacts with each hit. The first thing you will notice is very straightforward. Any damage value below 100 doesn't break through at all. Soulframe will still show 1 damage, but for all practical purposes, that hit isn't relevant. Everything below the armor belongs to the gray zone, the functionally unbeatable zone. Now let's raise the incoming hit to around 110. You swing for 110, but only about 10 points get through. That's 90.9% damage reduction, about 11 times the normal health. A boss that usually takes 3 minutes now takes half an hour. Technically killable, realistically misery. This is the red zone, the pain wall. Now let's move to 150 damage. The hit finally makes a dent, but most of it still gets absorbed. Only about 50 get through, roughly 1/3. That's 67% reduced, or about 3 times the enemy's normal health. This is the first zone where the fight becomes possible and acceptable if it happens only rarely, but it's still painfully slow. This is the orange zone. The "are we really doing this" area. Now let's look at 200 damage. Here, half of your hit finally get through. That corresponds to 50% mitigation, or doubling the enemy's health. For the first time, the fight feels legitimate. Still tough, but no longer unreasonable. This is a yellow zone. Challenging, not cruel. Next, let's raise the hit to 300 damage. Here, about 2/3 get through, around 200 damage. That's 33% reduced, or 1.5 times normal HP. This is where fights finally feel normal again. Enemies are a bit tankier, but not in a frustrating way. The damage is reduced, but the pacing of the fight still sits comfortably inside a normal time frame. This is the green zone. Tough, but fair. Now let's push the damage to 1000. At this point, the armor barely matters anymore. 900 damage still gets through, only a mild slowdown. That's about 11% mitigation, barely noticeable in real combat. This is a blue zone. Armor still exists, but it no longer defines the encounter. Once you go significantly beyond 1000 damage, anything above 10 times the armor, mitigation shrinks to single-digit percentages. Enemies in this zone technically have armor, but the effect is so small you will only notice it in combat logs. This is a white zone, where armor is functionally irrelevant. To keep it simple, you can think of this as a 7-zone model, starting at the point where your hits finally break past the threshold, then moving through ranges where armor's influence steadily shrinks, until eventually it fades out completely and stops functioning as meaningful mitigation at all. A flat armor system only really works inside a narrow window, roughly between about twice the armor value and 10 times the armor value. Below that, enemies become walls. Above it, armor stops mattering entirely. This also explains why very small upgrades can create massive breakpoints. If you are hitting for 110 damage into 100 armor, only 10 points get through. Switching to a weapon that hits for 130, a change of less than 20%, now gives you 30 real damage. On paper, it's a tiny upgrade. In practice, it triples your effective output. But if you're already in the blue or white zone, the exact same upgrade barely registers. In other words, flat armor only behaves like a real mitigation system inside a very narrow, tightly controlled number range. Let's make this concrete. Imagine a simple tabletop style game where every weapon deals somewhere between 2 and 14 damage. A dagger hits for 3 to 6, a longsword for 4 to 9 and a greatsword for 7 to 14. No leveling, no gear scaling, just a fixed, compact number range. Now give a heavily armored knight a flat armor value of 4. What happens? The dagger, most rolls fall below the armor, so only its high rolls punch through. It naturally struggles against heavy armor. The longsword, its range crosses the armor threshold more often, getting a few points through on most hits. Solid, but not exceptional. The greatsword, it beats the armor value almost every time, losing the least damage and delivering the most reliable output. It becomes the de facto armor breaker. Here's the important part. These rolls emerge automatically from the tight number range. Because armor sits in the same small band as the weapon damage, each weapon forms a clear relationship to the threshold. The greatsword deals far above it, the longsword overlaps the threshold, and the dagger, most of its rolls sit below the armor value, so only the highs get through, though you can always give it niche perks like backstabs or flanking bonuses if you wanted to shine elsewhere. In a small controlled system, flat armor always matters. The takeaway, flat armor works only when numbers stay close together. It remains relevant inside the entire game scope and natural weapon rolls appear on their own. Now let's look at the opposite extreme. A world where numbers rise fast, values drift apart and per hit damage can jump from a few dozen into the hundreds of thousands. The kind of scaling many live service RPGs eventually adopt. Soulframe isn't there today, but this example shows what happens to flat armor once a game's numbers range outgrows the system's comfort zone. Imagine a game where you begin your journey doing maybe 10 damage per hit. As you progress, unlock gear and start refining your build, that number climbs into the tens of thousands. And once power creep sets in, the late game metas, the perfect rolls, the end game only builds, you suddenly have players swinging for 50,000, 100,000, sometimes even 250,000 damage per hit. That kind of range isn't unusual in modern live service RPGs. It's practically expected. Now take that enormous number line and drop a single armor value into it. Just one number, 1000. What happens next is the entire point of this example. A new player, someone who just get their first real weapon, hits for 800. For them, this enemy is effectively off limits. A mid-game player dealing around 3000 damage has a totally different experience. They hit the armor head on, push through enough to feel challenged and walk away thinking, okay, this is tanky but fair. And then you reach the high-end players, the ones swinging for 20,000, 40,000 or more. For them, that same 1000 armor value becomes almost invisible. It shaves off a tiny fraction of their damage, and the enemy melts like anything else. And finally, the true min-max builds push this system so far beyond that point that the armor becomes a rounding error. They are doing 200,000 damage into a 1000-point shield. The enemy might as well be unarmored. One player sees an impossible brick wall, another sees a fair, well-designed encounter, another barely notices the armor exists. And the late game players won't even register it. Only a very small slice of the player base of this example, the ones dealing between about 1 and 5000 damage, actually interact with the armor as a mitigation system. Below that threshold, the enemy is effectively off limits. Above it, the armor collapses and becomes meaningless. A Softgate is different from a traditional level requirement. Instead of a hard rule, you can enter this dungeon at level 20, you can't hurt any enemy, and one level later you suddenly can. A Softgate fades in gradually. Once you pass the threshold, enemies are still extremely tough, but the further you climb above that requirement, the easier they become. And eventually, the challenge fully unlocks. But in Soulframe's case, or in general with flat armor reduction, it's not your character level that softgates you, it's your damage per hit. If your possible damage per hit sits below an enemy's armor value, that enemy isn't actually designed for you yet. The game won't tell you come back later, but that's what the armor is effectively saying. If your damage falls inside that narrow 2 to 5 times window, armor finally behaves as intended. Enemies are more tanky when armored. And the more you climb above that threshold, the more the enemy begins to feel unarmored. But once your damage climbs far above the armor value, the system collapses. The armor becomes cosmetic. It stops acting like mitigation. In a fully linear game, this could still be workable, even if it becomes annoying for developers to tightly figure out every enemy's numbers to match the player's growth. A good example is Gothic 2. Regularly, when you progressed the story or unlocked new regions, you were met with new enemy types, whose armor thresholds you had to catch up to. Think back to those heavily armored orcs that camped around the besieged fortress. You had to grind levels and gear until you finally pushed past their armor, and only then did your damage start to matter. That was a Softgate created by flat armor. But Soulframe isn't linear. And that's exactly where the system starts to crack. Because in an open co-op live service environment where players with wildly different builds and wildly different points of progression enter the same mission, a flat armor model begins to fall apart. Two players standing next to each other may not even be playing the same game. One is dealing 1 damage, one is dealing normal damage, one is ignoring the armor almost entirely. At that point, flat armor stops being a defensive system, it becomes a threshold check pretending to be one. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. Even without armor, open matchmaking naturally creates large power gaps in any live service game. High-level or meta-optimized players often deal many times the damage of less progressed or more casual players, simply because of gear differences, state of progression, or build optimization. But flat armor amplifies that gap. The optimized player not only deals more damage overall, they also enjoy the benefit of fighting enemies whose armor make up a minuscule percentage of their damage. Meanwhile, the weaker players get hit with the full effect of the armor wall. So the same enemy in the same mission ends up being 2 completely different encounters. The number range isn't the only challenge a flat armor model has to deal with. There's also the issue of attack frequency. In a percentage-based system, mitigation stays proportional no matter how often you hit. 1 attack or 20 attacks, each one loses the same relative portion of its damage. Flat armor doesn't behave like that. Here, Armor is applied to every single damage instance, every swing, every tick, every bolt, every pellet, which means something very simple but very destructive. Let's walk through a straightforward example. Imagine a longsword that deals 500 damage in a single swing. The enemy has 100 armor. One hit means 500 minus 100 equals 400 damage. Clean, predictable. Now look at our enthusiastic party member dual wielding some absurd rapid fire triple barrel crossbow contraption, firing 20 bolts per second while screaming like a maniac. Both players deal the same theoretical DPS, 500 damage per second. But the distribution is very different. The sword lands one big hit for 500, the crossbow fires 20 bolts for 25 damage each. And armor is applied to each bolt. The sword pays the 100-point armor tax once per second. The crossbow pays it 20 times per second. 25 damage per bolt minus 100 armor, that's 0. Soulframe will still show 1 damage, but functionally is nothing. The longsword still works. The rapid fire weapon is suddenly useless. And this isn't theoretical. You have already seen this in Soulframe. Arrow Rain, Orbit Blades on non-damage boosting pacts, Ignoth Wrath, or Sheldar's Phantom Flock. Anything that deals many small hits per second. All of these began falling off sharply in Preludes 11 because every hit triggers the armor subtraction. Unless you are running a pack like Tethren where your per hit value climbs high enough to break through the threshold, these abilities simply melt against armor. And even then, this won't scale forever. Imagine in higher difficulty where enemies gain more armor and players deal less damage. Right? That's literally coming. This creates a second major issue on top of the threshold problem. Flat armor doesn't just create soft gates, it also shifts the entire meta toward big single hit weapons. As long as the weapon is still inside the mitigation range, the slow heavy hitters dominate. In Preludes 11, the strongest weapons weren't the fast ones, they were the ones landing massive single hits well above the armor threshold. And since Soulframe is still early in development, this effect will become stronger as armor rises. Unless every weapon eventually ends up so far above the threshold that everything moves into the white zone, which technically fixes the problem but only by removing the armor system altogether. Right now, Soulframe is still early in its number curve. Before Preludes 11, most damage values were close enough together that flat armor behaved predictably. Some abilities underperformed, some were outliers, but everything stayed within a tight band where the armor model could function as intended. Preludes 11, however, marked the first moment where the system began to stretch beyond that comfort zone. The first pressure point is rising damage. Nothing is out of control yet, but the direction is obvious. Tethren and Ode Tempest are already capable of delivering multi-thousand damage hits, and every new prelude adds stronger weapons, new runes, new totems, and higher scalar effects. Preludes 12 will raise enemy difficulty and armor again, and long-term power creep is inevitable. As these values move upward, the narrow space where flat armor feels consistent begins to shrink, and the more Soulframe leans towards a large number RPG, the more fragile flat armor becomes. The second pressure point is multi-hit ability degradation. We saw the first signs of this clearly in Preludes 11. In Preludes 10, abilities like Phantom Flock, Ignoth Wrath, Arrow Rain and Orbit Blades could still push at least some damage through. But once armor value rose in Preludes 11, those individual hits fell below the armor per hit threshold. Against high armor enemies, these abilities were effectively erased. They simply stopped contributing damage. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about smite procs here. That's a separate interaction entirely. This is purely about the base hit values. And with Preludes 12 introducing Koga difficulty, which raises enemy levels and therefore their armor values, Stampede may be the next skill to slip below the per hit threshold. Its per hit values are already hovering uncomfortably close to the cutoff. The pattern is consistent. When armor rises, abilities that deal many small hits are punished first and hardest. To see where this trajectory leads, consider a realistic future scenario. Imagine a casual or mid-level player dealing around 50,000 damage per hit in endgame, while a well-optimized player deals closer to 250,000. Now imagine high-tier enemies with around 40,000 armor. For the 50,000 player, that 40,000 armor is catastrophic. It removes 80% of their damage, reducing 50,000 down to 10,000. For the 250,000 player, the armor is barely noticeable. They lose only about 16%, dropping from 250,000 to 210,000. This creates a dramatic distortion. The optimized player deals 5 times more raw damage, but 20 times more final damage after armor is applied. Casual players effectively become soft-gated, and multi-hit archetypes get pushed out of viability unless every individual hit can rise well above the armor threshold. This happens because flat armor punishes wide number ranges. This is why the issue matters now rather than later. Soulframe's armor model isn't broken, but it was built for a much tighter span of values than the game is gradually expanding into. Prelude 11 has already shown widening damage scaling, rising armor thresholds, increasing penalties on multi-hit frequency, and a growing gap between low and high damage builds. These points don't just accumulate, they amplify each other. And as they do, flat armor stops acting like a meaningful mitigation and begins acting like a simple participation check. Soulframe is approaching a point where the developers will need to choose the game's long-term scaling direction, because as the numbers continue to stretch, the current armor model may not stretch with them. So does all of this mean flat armor is inherently a bad system? Not at all. Game systems are tools, and they only really make sense when they are used for the right job and within the right number ranges. By now, we have seen the two big failure points clearly: wide damage ranges that stretch the system until it breaks, and attack frequency, where many small hits get punished far more than a few big ones. So, can flat armor be used in a way that avoid those two traps instead of running straight into them? One of the cleanest uses for flat absorption is when it's functional, not global. Imagine you are playing a tank in an MMO. You already have the usual person-based mitigation everyone knows: armor, shields, maybe some damage reduction buffs. Then you unlock a special ability that simply says reduce every incoming hit by 10. In that context, flat absorption is perfect. If you're surrounded by 20 small enemies, subtracting 10 from each attack suddenly prevents a massive amount of total damage. In a one-on-one boss fight, it barely matters. Which is exactly the intention, is situational armor meant to counter large groups or rapid hit enemies, not a rule that governs the entire combat system. The same logic works on the enemy side. You can absolutely design a unique armored steam tank that subtracts a large fixed value from every hit. It becomes a special encounter players have to adapt to, as long as they can adapt. For example, by swapping to heavier weapons or different abilities. What doesn't work is a game where a rogue is permanently locked into a rapid fire crossbow and has no way to respond to an enemy build to specifically counter rapid fire attacks. Functional armor works when it's intentional, not universal. A selective approach can also help with the attack frequency problem. Imagine one enemy faction is heavily armored and uses flat absorption while another is mostly unarmored. If multi-hit weapons are deliberately designed to have higher base DPS, they naturally shine against the unarmored faction, while big single hit tools become the obvious answer to the armored one. That creates room for both playstyles without letting flat armor globally crush rapid hit builds. There are also examples where flat armor works as a general rule, as long as the number stays small and progression is tightly controlled. We already highlighted Gothic 2 before, and it's a very good case. Higher armor values were unlocked alongside story and region progression, and you were meant to catch up to those thresholds as the story advanced. Because damage values never exploded into huge ranges, flat armor remained stable and predictable all the way through. You can also introduce special rules to soften those unwanted interactions. Look at the Feybolt joinery you can attach to a magic weapon. Right now, it's a bit awkward. It comes with its own quirks, like enemies messing up the damage build up by starting to permablock, but the underlying idea is exactly one example of a design that can compensate for the weakness of multi-hit attacks. Every individual hit builds damage until the weapon's per hit value rises into the same range as the heavy hitters, and sometimes even surpasses them, but only after a build-up period. That's one way to make a fast weapon functional again in a flat armor world. You don't change the armor, you temporarily change the zone your weapon sits in. Soulframe also already has armor negating stats on totems. At the moment, they are extremely mild and don't stack, so they don't really solve the one damage wall problem, but the concept is there. In theory, you could push them further or introduce more tools that selectively reduce armor for certain builds or abilities. Flat armor disproportionately punishes multi-hit abilities, but that relationship works both ways. Whenever armor is lowered by a flat value, multi-hit attacks gain far more value than their single-hit counterparts. On paper, the toolbox looks rich. Mechanics like Fable that charge up multi-hit damage, stats that partially ignore armor, ability tuned specifically to counter heavily armored enemies, and counter designs that reward swapping into the right damage profile. The danger is what happens when you start stacking all of these fixes on top of each other. Every time a second system is added to solve a problem created by the first one, every time an exception, modifier, conditional buff, unique rule or workaround is layered over the top, you create another dependency that has to be balanced, maintained and explained. Over the years, those small fixes add up. What starts as a simple attempt to help multi-hit weapons keep up can slowly turn into a laundry list of special cases. Taken together, this gives us a clear picture. Flat armor works best in 3 conditions: small number ranges, controlled linear progression and clearly defined functional roles like anti-swarm or special encounter. Outside of that, it becomes increasingly brittle. You can support it with extra mechanics, armor ignore stats, charge up systems, special counters, but every added exception undermines the original appeal of flat armor, its simplicity. Over time, those band-aids stack into complexity and maintenance overhead, especially in a live service environment where numbers escalate and player power varies wildly. And that's the core issue. As Soulframe grows into a larger, longer-running RPG, keeping flat armor stable will demand more and more compensating systems. That kind of layering ages like milk in a long-running game, which naturally leads to the bigger question. If flat armor struggles to scale, what's the alternative? Percentage-based mitigation is the obvious contender, but it carries its own scaling risks and design pitfalls. Percentage systems are relative. If you take 50% less damage, you take half damage, whether the attack deals 10 points or 100,000. That's their biggest strength. They scale cleanly, no matter how wild the number range becomes. But there's a catch, and it's a big one. Everyone understands what 50% damage reduction means. You take half damage. Your effective health doubles. Very intuitive. But the moment you step away from these neat numbers, things become much less obvious. For example, 25% reduction doesn't mean a quarter tougher. It means times 1.33 more effective HP. 75% reduction means 4 times more effective HP. 90% reduction means 10 times more effective HP. 99% reduction means 100 times more effective HP. That curve is exponential. The closer you get to 100%, the more explosive the impact becomes. And most players, and frankly many designers, don't instinctively see how much power is hidden behind a small shift in percentage. This is why just at 5% more reduction, when you are already close enough to the high values, sometimes accidentally doubles a character's real survivability. Percentage systems look clean on paper, but they constantly trick both players and designers into underestimating their real impact. They scale beautifully until they suddenly don't. And to understand why, it helps to start with a very familiar example. Dungeons & Dragons uses additive armor class bonuses. A +2 armor class buff is always 10% less chance to be hit. Sounds simple. But the impact depends completely on your starting point. If you are already hard to hit, say the enemy only connects 20% of the time, adding that 10% reduction doubles your durability. If the enemy hits you 80% of the time, the exact same +2 AC barely moves the needle. The curve is still exponential, it's just hidden behind convenient math. This leads to a situation every D&D veteran knows. You feel invincible with armor class 22, until you meet a monster with a high attack bonus and heavy damage. Suddenly you go from getting hit 5% of the time to 25% of the time, and that bigger X hits twice as hard. Your survivability collapses in a single encounter. 5 times higher chance to get hit, 2 times more damage per hit, and you will go down 10 times faster. All of that because of +4 to hit and a bigger X. This illustrates the core instability of additive percentage-based systems once the numbers get high enough. Because of issues like this, many MMOs eventually invented their own ways of taming the exponential curve. Elder Scrolls Online, for example, keeps total mitigation deliberately capped. No single passive damage reduction value crosses the 50% line. Block is the one exception, but that's an active defense system, meant specifically to counter extreme boss hits for tanks, not part of the baseline mitigation curve. And when multiple sources stack, they do so multiplicatively. The first armor layer reduces damage by 50%, the second layer reduces another 50% of what remains. Result is 75% total reduction, not 100%. It's excellent for stability, but from a player perspective, it becomes nearly impossible to tell what your actual final mitigation is once several effects interact. Clear numbers on the tooltip, unclear results, and player communication in practice. World of Warcraft approached the problem differently. Instead of capping values or relying on multiplicative stacking, it tied armor to a non-linear diminishing returns formula. The more armor you have, the less damage reduction you gain from it. This directly counters the hidden exponential gains of percentage-based reduction. It was extremely clever for its time, and it allowed WoW's scaling to remain stable over 20 years of expansions, while some competitors of the era had lesser elegant systems. Percentage-based systems solve a different set of problems and bring their own challenges with them. Percentage-based systems scale gracefully across extremely large damage ranges, and at first glance they are very easy to understand, but they become increasingly dangerous the closer they get to the upper limits. Small nudges can double real survivability, which means designers need clever math behind the scenes to keep everything from spiraling out of control. So no, neither percentage systems nor flat armor is universally right. Each model remains reliable only when the game's scaling sits inside the boundaries that the system can handle. And the real question isn't which system is better, but rather what kind of game is Soulframe trying to become in the long run? Because if the world expands, if damage ranges grow, if players diverge wildly in power, percentage mitigation naturally handled that scaling more gracefully. Flat mitigation can still work, but only if surrounded by a large number of framing systems, exceptions, counters, compensators, and special case rules. And that leads directly into a bigger topic, because every one of those extra rules is ultimately a balance decision. So when we talk about where the system is heading, the discussion naturally circles back to a single question. Why do we balance any of this in the first place? Is a more balanced game automatically a better game? And the honest answer is not necessarily. For me personally, City of Heroes, one of my all-time favorite MMOs, was full of bizarre, old-school design ideas. By modern standards, a lot of its mechanics were objectively bad. Yet the game still created unforgettable memories. I still revisit it decades later, because the fantasy it delivered lined up perfectly with what I enjoy in an RPG. But here's the important part. Even though the game worked, even though some people loved it intensely, many parts of its system left whole playstyles behind. Certain builds thrived in almost every situation, while others only felt good in a very narrow circumstance or not at all. With a bit more balance, not total homogenization, just thoughtful tuning, the game could have supported far more viable builds, more roles, more creative expressions. That's what balance means to me. Not making every character perform exactly the same in every situation. That would eliminate the reason we love the different classes in the first place. Balance is about expanding the number of playstyles that are both fun and effective. A well-balanced game gives more room to experiment, more viable approaches to endgame, more replayability, more identity for each class, role or build. And that's why imbalance can become a long-term problem. If one category of tools like high single hit weapons is always the best answer and rapid hit style always underperform, the game slowly loses variety. Entire playstyles stop being worth using outside of niche memes. On the other hand, overbalancing can also hurt a game. If every edge is sanded down, if nothing stands out, if everything feels identical for the sake of balance, then no one gets to feel special. Unique class identity disappears. Balance should enrich the game, not flatten it. In Soulframe's case, this isn't about forcing everything to deal the same damage, it's about making sure multiple playstyles can exist side by side. Heavy hitters, rapid strikers, ability-based builds, utility setups, all meaningful, all viable. That's why discussions like this matter. Good balance isn't about making a game perfect, it's about giving players more ways to enjoy it, more tools that actually work, and more reasons to keep playing years down the line. Let's help DE get there, to a place where we can all enjoy Soulframe for years to come. Soulframe is trying something bold with flat absorption. It's clear, readable and easy to understand, but like every defensive model, it has limits. This video isn't about choosing a correct system, it's about understanding the one we are actually playing with, so that our feedback hits the real pressure points. Because we already seeing the early signs. Once you understand why these things happen, you will notice them in your own gameplay. Which abilities fall off, which weapon break through, which tools only work in certain zones of the system. And you will be able to give clearer, more actionable feedback. So if you're a numbers player, go test things. If you play by feel, tell DE when something suddenly stops being fun. Both types of feedback matter. I hope this helped you understand the system a little better. Good luck out there, envoys. And if a dagger can't pierce the armor, well, sometimes a greatsword will do the trick. And of course, a like and a sub are always appreciated.